For decades, millions of fans believed they knew this character. They believed they understood his choices, his honor, his very soul. Then they watched the film, and what they saw on screen made them question whether Peter Jackson had read the same book they had. A nobleman who, in the pages of J.R.R., Tolkien refuses the most dangerous object in the history of Middle-earth without a moment of hesitation, becomes on the screen a man tempted by greed, a man willing to drag two innocent hobbits into a war zone just to please his father. This single decision would go on to become the most debated, most argued, most furiously discussed change in the entire adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths behind the biggest stories ever put on screen, stay with us, because what we are about to reveal changes the way you will watch this saga forever. Let's set the scene. The year is 2002. Peter Jackson has already delivered The Fellowship of the Ring, a film so beloved that expectations for its sequel, The Two Towers, are almost impossible to meet. Tolkien's original novel is not structured the way most stories are told. It does not move back and forth between characters scene by scene. Instead, the book is split into two enormous self-contained halves. The first half follows the war in Rohan. The second half follows Frodo and Sam's journey toward Mordor. Readers finish one entire storyline before starting the next. For a novel, this works beautifully. It allows Tolkien to build tension slowly, to let each thread breathe on its own. But for a 2.5-hour film, this structure is a problem. Audiences sitting in a theater do not want to spend 90 minutes in Rohan, and then suddenly, with no warning, jump backward in time to relive the same weeks through Frodo's eyes. So Jackson and his writing team made a decision that would define the entire trilogy's rhythm. They wove the timelines together. Rohan, Frodo, Sam, Gollum, Merry, Pippin, Treebeard, all of it interlaced, cutting back and forth, so the audience feels like they are watching one unified war unfold on multiple fronts at once. This decision alone required moving entire events across the story. The death of Boromir, which in the book actually opens the Two Towers, was pulled backward and placed at the end of the first film instead. Meanwhile, the darkest moment of Frodo's journey in the second book, the encounter with the giant spider Shelob, his apparent death, and his capture by orcs, was pushed forward into the third film. On paper, this looks like a simple structural adjustment. In practice, it reorganized the emotional architecture of the entire trilogy. It changed where each film's climax lands, what each film's cliffhanger is, and how audiences experience hope and despair across 3 separate theatrical releases. But structural reshuffling is the easy part to justify. What sparked real controversy, what fans are still arguing about in forums and comment sections today, are the choices made about character, motivation, and morality. And nowhere is that more visible than in the transformation of Faramir, son of the Steward of Gondor. In the novel, Faramir is introduced as one of the wisest, most self-possessed characters in the entire saga. When Frodo and Sam stumble into his camp near Ithilien, he could seize the ring immediately. He has every justification to do so. His people are losing a desperate war, and the ring could turn the tide. Instead, Faramir listens. He learns what the ring truly is. And he makes a statement that has become one of the most quoted lines in Tolkien's writing, that he would not take this thing even if he found it lying on the road. He says this not as a boast, but as a simple statement of who he is. He then helps the hobbits continue their journey, asking for nothing in return except that they remember him kindly. Now compare that to the film. On screen, Faramir captures Frodo and Sam, and initially decides to bring them, and the ring, back to his father in the ruined city of Osgiliath, hoping the ring might restore his father's faith in him. The hobbits are marched through a war zone. Frodo is even brought face to face with a Nazgul, one of the ring's most terrifying servants, in a sequence that exists nowhere in the book. Only after witnessing the corrupting pull the ring has on Frodo does Faramir change his mind and let them go. When the film was released, longtime readers were furious. To them, this wasn't a minor tweak. It was a fundamental rewrite of a character's soul. Faramir was supposed to be proof that not everyone in Middle-earth is seduced by power. He was Tolkien's answer to the question of whether virtue is even possible in a world engulfed by war. And the film, some argued, erased that entire meaning. But here's what's fascinating. The filmmakers didn't make this change carelessly. Screenwriter Philippa Boyens and director Peter Jackson have spoken publicly about their reasoning. Their argument was this: if Faramir resists the ring's temptation as effortlessly as he does in the book, it actually undercuts the power of the ring itself. Viewers had already watched Boromir, Faramir's own brother, become consumed by the ring's influence to the point of trying to steal it by force. If Faramir, just one story later, shrugs off that same temptation without breaking a sweat, the ring starts to look less like an object of ultimate corrupting power and more like a plot device that only works on characters the story wants it to work on. By making Faramir struggle, even briefly, the filmmakers were trying to reinforce the idea that no one is fully safe from the ring's pull. It was a trade-off. They sacrificed a piece of Faramir's purity to protect the credibility of the story's central object of dread. Is that justification enough? That's a question fans have debated for over 20 years, and there's no universal answer. What we can say is that this wasn't a random creative accident. It was a deliberate storytelling calculation made under the pressure of translating an internal, literary theme into something that plays convincingly on screen in real time. If you're enjoying peeling back these layers between what an author intended and what a film adaptation delivers, consider sticking around, because we uncover stories like this every week. And the next revelation in this very film might surprise you even more, because Faramir isn't the only argument raging in Tolkien fandom. There's a second controversy, quieter, but arguably even more fascinating, because it isn't really about the movie at all. It's about the book's own title. Ask any hardcore Tolkien reader which Two Towers the title The Two Towers actually refers to, and you may get 3 or 4 completely different answers, because even Tolkien himself never fully settled the question. Here's the strange truth. Tolkien intended the phrase "the Two Towers" primarily as a marketing convenience for splitting his enormous single novel into 3 published volumes, not as a definitive symbolic statement. In his own letters, he wavered on which towers he meant. One version he sketched for a proposed cover illustration paired Orthanc, the tower belonging to the wizard Saruman in Isengard, with Minas Morgul, the corrupted fortress that once belonged to the forces of good before falling into darkness and becoming a stronghold of evil. In other letters, Tolkien floated an entirely different pairing. Orthanc, alongside the Tower of Cirith Ungol, the Orc watchtower near Shelob's lair, deep in Mordor's borderlands. Notice what both of these interpretations have in common. They're steeped in a specific kind of symbolism. Towers that were not always evil, structures that used to belong to the forces of light before being twisted, corrupted, or abandoned to darkness. Minas Morgul, in particular, carries enormous tragic weight in the books. It was once Minas Ithil, a shining city built by the exiled prince of Gondor, before it was captured and transformed into a place of horror. Tolkien's ambiguity about the title seems to hint at a theme running underneath the entire saga. The idea that darkness doesn't simply invade from outside. It often grows from something that was once good and was allowed to rot. Peter Jackson, faced with the demands of a blockbuster franchise and the need for clean, easily understood visual iconography, made a very different choice. In his films, the Two Towers are explicitly and visually defined. Orthanc, home of Saruman, and Barad-dûr, the towering fortress of Sauron himself in the heart of Mordor. This choice is clean, dramatic, and instantly understandable to any audience member, even someone who has never opened the books. It visually represents the alliance between 2 great evils joining forces against the free peoples of Middle-earth. But in making that choice, Jackson traded away Tolkien's more melancholic, more morally complex symbolism, towers that fell from grace, for something more straightforward, towers that were simply evil from a clear external threat. It's a small decision on the surface, but it reshapes the emotional undertone of the title itself. Tolkien's version whispers a warning about corruption from within. Jackson's version delivers a clear visual statement about evil forces uniting from without. Neither interpretation is wrong, and that's precisely what makes this controversy so compelling to literary scholars. Tolkien scholars have written entire academic papers debating this exact ambiguity, and the truth is, we may never have a single definitive answer, because Tolkien passed away without ever settling it conclusively himself. Now here's where things escalate even further, because the fan disagreements don't stop at characters and titles. They extend into entire battle sequences that were invented wholesale for the screen. Picture the Battle of Helm's Deep, one of the most celebrated action sequences in the entire trilogy. In the film, as the forces of Rohan brace for an overwhelming siege by Saruman's army of Uruk-hai, something extraordinary happens. An army of elves, led by the warrior Haldir, marches in to fight alongside the humans. It's a visually stunning, emotionally rousing moment. Different races of Middle-earth setting aside their history of division to stand together against annihilation. Except it never happens in the book, not even close. In Tolkien's original text, Rohan's defenders at Helm's Deep are entirely human. There is no elven reinforcement. There is no Haldir at that battle at all. In fact, Haldir's death in the film is itself an invention, since the character barely factors into the events of the second book in any comparable way. The entire sequence, elves and all, was created from scratch for the screen. Why would Jackson invent an entire allied army for a battle that, in the source material, is a story about humans standing alone? The reasoning ties back to something deeper in the thematic architecture of the films. Throughout the trilogy, Jackson was building toward a grand, unifying idea for the climax of The Return of the King, the image of all the free peoples of Middle-earth, previously divided by pride, mistrust, and old grudges, finally uniting against a common darkness. Introducing the elves at Helm's Deep gave that theme an earlier emotional beat, a rehearsal for unity before the final battles. It also, quite simply, made for a visually spectacular battle scene, featuring two very different fighting styles, clashing side by side against a common enemy. But for readers, this edition struck at something they valued deeply about the original story: the idea that Rohan's victory at Helm's Deep was earned entirely by the courage of ordinary men, farmers, and soldiers with no magical aid, standing against overwhelming odds and surviving through sheer will and the timely arrival of Gandalf, with reinforcements led by a minor character named Erkenbrand, a figure the films quietly wrote out of existence entirely, replacing him with the previously banished writer Éomer instead. This is the tension at the heart of every major book-to-film controversy in this saga. It isn't usually about incompetence or carelessness. It's about a fundamental difference in what a story can accomplish on the page versus what it can accomplish visually, in real time, in front of a mass audience. A novel can spend chapters building internal resolve, quiet nobility, moral steadfastness that requires no external drama to feel powerful. A film, competing for attention in 2.5 hours, often needs external visible conflict: a fall from a cliff, a temptation on screen, an army arriving at the last possible second, to create the same emotional impact through action rather than introspection. Take, for example, one of the more subtle changes fans still discuss: Aragorn's fall from a cliff during an ambush by warg riders on the way to Helm's Deep. This entire sequence, the ambush, Aragorn tumbling down a ravine, being presumed dead, and the emotional weight this puts on the rest of the group, exists nowhere in Tolkien's text. In the book, the company simply travels onward together. No separation, no near-death cliffhanger. The film needed a moment of doubt, a moment where the audience fears its hero might be gone, to heighten the emotional stakes heading into the siege. Tolkien didn't need that scene, because his tension was built through pacing, dialogue, and dread accumulated over many chapters. Jackson, working in a visual medium with limited runtime, manufactured a physical, external crisis to generate the same feeling faster. You can see this same pattern again in the relationship between Frodo, Sam, and Gollum. In the film, there's a devastating moment where Gollum manipulates the situation so that Sam appears to have eaten the last of their food, prompting an anguished Frodo to send Sam away, alone, right before the two of them must face the horror of Shelob's lair. It's heartbreaking, and it works powerfully on screen because it isolates our protagonist emotionally at his most vulnerable moment. But in the book, this betrayal and separation simply doesn't happen. Frodo and Sam enter the darkness of the tunnel together, side by side, their bond unbroken. The film needed a moment of maximum emotional isolation for its climax. The book found its horror in togetherness facing the unknown, rather than in abandonment. Even Gollum's psychological duality, the war between his gentler Sméagol persona and his corrupted Gollum persona, is treated differently across the two mediums. In the text, this internal conflict is present, but it's woven subtly into narration and dialogue. On screen, thanks largely to Andy Serkis's motion capture performance, this same conflict becomes an external visual spectacle. Gollum arguing with himself, literally split across the frame, wrestling with his own reflection. What was internal and literary becomes theatrical and visual, because film, unlike prose, has no direct access to a character's inner monologue unless it externalizes that struggle somehow. If you're starting to notice a pattern here, you're exactly right. Almost every controversial change traces back to this same underlying tension. Literature can dwell inside a character's mind, while film must show us everything from the outside. And sometimes, in solving that translation problem, filmmakers make choices that reshape the very meaning of a story. Consider Arwen, Aragorn's beloved. In Tolkien's actual text of The Two Towers, she is almost entirely absent. Her story exists mostly in an appendix at the very end of the entire trilogy, told after the main narrative has already concluded. Yet in the films, Jackson expands her role dramatically, using flashbacks, visions, and invented dialogue to give her a much larger emotional presence throughout the story, turning her into an active emotional anchor for Aragorn's arc. Some fans criticized this as an unnecessary departure. Others argued it solved a real structural problem. Without this expansion, one of the trilogy's central romantic relationships would barely register on screen at all, since it's largely relegated to footnotes in the source material. Once again, a translation problem, solved by invention, at the cost of strict faithfulness. Even something as seemingly minor as the fate of the wizard Saruman and his servant Grima Wormtongue became a point of fan debate. In the book, after their defeat at Isengard, both men are left imprisoned in Orthank's tower, guarded by the Ents, alive, humbled, but not killed off. In the extended edition of the third film, however, their story concludes very differently. Saruman is stabbed by Grima atop the tower and falls to his death, while Grima himself is struck down by an arrow from Legolas. This dramatic finale gives the film trilogy a clean, definitive sense of closure for these villains, something audiences generally crave, even though it directly contradicts the more ambiguous, unresolved fate Tolkien had written for them. So, after walking through all of this, the restructured timeline, Faramir's rewritten morality, the ambiguous meaning of the title itself, the invented battles, the manufactured betrayals, the expanded romances, the altered endings, what should we actually take away from all of this? Here's the deeper truth. Adaptation is not betrayal, and it's not always improvement either. It's translation. Every choice we've examined today exists because a story built for one medium, the intimate, internal, patient medium of the written word, had to be reshaped for an entirely different medium, one built on visual spectacle, compressed runtime, and constant forward momentum. Peter Jackson and his team weren't trying to erase Tolkien's vision. They were trying to solve an almost impossible puzzle. How do you take hundreds of pages of internal reflection, slow-building dread, and quiet nobility, and turn it into something that grips an audience sitting in a theater for 2.5 hours, competing for their attention against the memory of countless other films? Sometimes that translation succeeds so well, it becomes iconic. Think of the sweeping visual scale of Helm's Deep, or the haunting physicality of Gollum's internal war brought to life. Sometimes it sacrifices something precious. The purity of Faramir's original resistance, the melancholy of Tolkien's original title, the unity of Frodo and Sam facing darkness side by side. And sometimes, it simply creates a different, equally valid story, one that exists in conversation with the original, rather than as a perfect replica of it. The real controversy, then, isn't really about who was right, Tolkien or Jackson. It's about something much bigger, the eternal tension between fidelity and interpretation, between honoring a story exactly as it was written and reimagining it in a way that speaks to a new medium, a new audience, and a new era. Every generation that adapts a beloved story faces this same impossible choice, and every time some fans will feel betrayed, while others will feel like they've witnessed something new born from something old. What do you think? Was Peter Jackson right to sacrifice Faramir's purity to strengthen the ring's menace? Should the elves have ever set foot in Helm's Deep? Tell us in the comments which side of this debate you land on, and if you want us to dig into the next great controversy hiding behind another legendary film, subscribe to the channel, because the gap between the story we read and the story we watch is far deeper and far more fascinating than most people ever realize. And this is only the beginning of that journey.